Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Rebecca Friedman, and I'm founding director of the Wolfsonian Public Humanities Lab at Florida International University. Welcome to today's installment, the last of the season, of season 3, Coffee and Conversations, discussing contemporary issues with Miami Book Fair. With the presidential election finally settled, the Senate in play, racism continuing to rage, and the coronavirus part of our everyday vocabulary, today's conversation is very welcome. So thank you all for tuning in, and thank you guys for being here. As you by now know, we first began the series Coffee and Conversations at the start of the coronavirus pandemic and the quarantine. We have talked over these months with a host of directors of cultural institutions around the country and world. It seemed to us that the responsibility and power of cultural institutions had never been and has never been more poignant. Then we turned to the longstanding pandemic of racism and anti-Blackness in this country in season 2, Cultural Institutions and Histories of Anti-Blackness. And today we continue to engage in conversations about arts and culture in this moment. In season 3, this collaboration with Miami Book Fair. The collaboration involves several of the most well-known thinkers living and writing today, all of whom will be participating in the 37th Miami Book Fair between November 15 to 22nd, just around the corner. And to top it off, our final guest in this series today, we have the wonderful poet, John Murillo, who just released his latest collection, Contemporary American Poetry. He himself is the son of an African-American father and Mexican mother, poet and playwright. John Murillo grew up in LA. He was educated at Howard University and NYU, where he earned his MFA. In a Q&A with the Poetry Society of America, he states, "I write, first of all, in the tradition of the witness." And we certainly see that in this collection. Murillo's debut poetry collection, Up Jump the Boogie, 2010, was a finalist for the Kate Tufts Discovery Award and the Penn Open Book Award, and was also named one of Huffington Post's 10 recent books of poetry you should read right now. His poetry has been included in Angels of Ascent, a Norton anthology of African-American poetry. His choreo play Trigger premiered with the Edgeworks Dance Theater in 2011. His additional honors are many, so I will just say a few of them here. They include Larry Neal Writers Awards, a Pushcart Prize, and fellowships from the Cave Canaan Foundation, the Breadloaf Writers Conference, the Fine Arts Work Center, among many others. He teaches at Hampshire College and at NYU and lives in Brooklyn. So welcome, John. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
And he is joined by our wonderful colleague, Ana Menendez, who is our recent hire at FIU in our Public Humanities Lab. She's also an associate professor of English in the Department of English of Creative Writing at FIU. Ana just published Traveling with Myself, a chapter in Exile in Global Literature and Culture, edited by FIU colleagues Dr. Sutton and Milbauer. And she is currently working on a new novel, for the moment entitled Castle of the Stranger, although she tells us the title might change yet again. So welcome to both of you. It's an honor to be here with you today. It's the best part of my job. Very briefly, our format is simple. Our two guests will talk for about 20 minutes with one another, and then we'll take questions from the audience for the remaining 10. So at any time, you can submit a question using the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. So without any further words from me, I turn it over to Ana. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And thank you, John, for being here today. I know that, we've all done way too many of these Zoom interviews. And I'm, on behalf of all of us at the Wolfsonia, we're so thrilled and proud that you've agreed to it. And it is just a joy always to be in conversation with you. I wonder if you could get us started by reading the title poem from this collection.
I can. And thank you for having me, you guys. This is really cool. Contemporary American Poetry. Another Monday, and you're out with some poets, one of whom, maybe you, has just given a reading, and it's summer, and it's Brooklyn, or it's the village, and it's winter, and you've landed at some dusty dive bar, crowded around and ate top to order wings, shots, and whatnot, when halfway down the table, you hear one poet congratulate a second on some prize or another, while a third sulks, sips his gimlet, and pretends not to listen. And a fourth mumbles something about not being notified his application was even received, and how you have to be gay or black or both to win anything these days. And the fifth poet pushes a plate of nachos toward you and asks what you think about the state of contemporary American poetry. And before you can answer, a sixth pries in, mishearing, of course, the last few syllables and waxes cerebral, something about Don share or plowshares or maybe even timeshares. And on the television mounted hanging overhead, an anchor woman's mouthing the muted news of another boy shot, dead, and black in some city now burning. And the police chief promises a thorough investigation. And a Yemeni woman is burning, splashed with acid for loving who she chooses. And everywhere you think is burning, burning. And yes, you hear a graduate student quip between slurps about a newly dead master. I tried to like his work, may he rest in peace. But try as I might, I found him too accessible. Another Monday and it's summer in Brooklyn, or it's the village and winter. You're with the poets, one of whom, the political poet, the outsider poet, has brought along a selfie stick. You put your shot glass to your mouth. What's inside is burning, burning. Everybody now, squeeze in tight. Everybody now, say cheese.
See, that makes me want to just have you spend the next 20 minutes just reading. Um, it's such a brilliant book on so many levels, and that poem for me captures the spirit of it because it's absolutely devastating. It's full of rage, but also a lot of humor, and in so many ways, you know, I mean, we both came through NYU. And it speaks to the ambition, the envy, the pettiness, right, inherent in this kind of work. And I think this is where your fierce poet's eye is evident. It illuminates that place by the time we get to the outsider and the selfie stick between witness and performance. You know, where do we go with the confessional, especially as artists of color?
Sure.
Can you talk a little bit about writing that poem and how it came to be the title poem instead of, say, the sonnet cycle, The Refusal to Mourn?
Sure. The poet came out of my growing dissatisfaction with the state of the business side of contemporary American poetry, if you will, right? And you mentioned ambition, you mentioned pettiness. There's a petty ambition that I think that kind of permeates, you know, a lot of the culture nowadays. There's an essay by Donald Hall, Poetry and Ambition, where he talks about you know, the cycles that one goes through as an artist, right? And how maybe when you're 15, your desire is to be great, to be mentioned among the Dickinsons and the Whitmans and the Nerudas of the world. And then at 24, your ambition is to be published in the New Yorker, right? And you know, so the idea is that, you know, your ambition kind of narrows, and then at some point maybe you grow out of that, and then you know, the hope is to be great, and then we have to talk ourselves and coach ourselves through these different cycles. The poem came when I was actually coming through one of those cycles. There was a few years where I had a pretty good run where I was winning, you know, a few prizes, fellowships, and awards, and started to feel entitled to such. And I underwent a religious process where I had, part of my initiation was I had to stay away from social media and, you know, things of the sort. And when I was away and came back, I didn't really like what I'd seen. nor did I like what I saw in myself, right? So the poem is, it's a commentary on that petty ambition that privileges career, accolades, all right, reputation above the work. But it's also a self-critique because, in many ways, I was each of the poets mentioned in that, right? It came to be the title poem. How did that happen? I don't know. The book as a whole for me was that as well. It was a critique on the vapidity of contemporary American poetry, and also a call to self to kind of return to the reasons I started writing in the first place, right? The thing that first drew me to the page. Um, the title is spelled with K's, K in contemporary, K in American, in part because my publisher and I were worried that uh, spelling it the regular way with C's, people would think it's either a very short anthology or a critical text. So it was just a way to kind of make it clear that this was the title. And then lastly, I'll say, and I've said this elsewhere, that in spelling it with the two Ks, whenever you see two Ks, I don't know about you, but I always wait for the third K to drop, which is, I think, also it's kind of a happy accident. I didn't intend that when I titled the book the way I did, but it ended up being a commentary on the state of America, right, and how racism isn't always as blatant as you would expect, but sometimes it's just under the surface. That third K is unannounced and often doesn't need to be.
Yeah, that takes me to the next question, because you mentioned in one poem, one of my favorite poems, in The Refusal to Mourn the Deaths by Gunfire, that these are the same fires that have always been burning in America.
Yes.
And I wanted to talk about that poem because I remember when it was published in the American Poetry Review 2-3 years ago, it was all many of us could talk about. And reading it, I was reminded, what Kafka had said about books, that we need ones that affect us like a disaster. And this poem is the axe for the frozen sea within us as a country, I think. And it's sadly always relevant. And I know that it made the rounds again this year, after this summer, after the murder of George Floyd. So I have so many questions because there's so much to talk about this powerful and beautiful cycle. How did you come to it, and how did you settle specifically on its form? What was your decision to contain this fire and rage within this very old and orderly form of the sonnet?
Yeah, I needed it. The event that gave rise to the poem was the double murder suicide of two New York City police officers and a Baltimore man called Ishmael Brinsley. One morning in December, I think 2015, he shot his girlfriend in the stomach and then hopped a bus from Baltimore to New York with the intention of killing some police officers. And this was in response to, I think, I can't remember how many killings, what was the most recent killing at that point, right? They sent out an all points bulletin about him. They knew he was coming, but they still, New York is a big city. That same day, there was a poets rally in Washington Square Park, and we were reading poems in protest of police shootings and police violence. And it was probably the best poetry reading I've ever been to. A lot of, my favorite poets, a lot of your favorite poets were there. But I remember leaving that reading feeling very empty, feeling that we had expressed and performed our outrage to one another. But at the end of the day, America was still America. And feeling that's, I wish I had it in me to do something more. I got home that afternoon and learned that somebody had done something more, that Ishmael Brinsley had in fact taken the bus to New York City, found two police officers sitting in a parked car and shot them both at point blank range. He was then chased underground onto a subway platform and then shot himself in the head and died. When I got the news, I felt everything. I felt joy, I felt sorrow, I felt relief, I felt guilt, right? So the poem was my way of processing all this. So I knew I needed not just a couple pages or a couple stanzas, I needed, right, some length. Around the same time, I'd gone home to visit some family in California, and I was, it was around the 25th anniversary of the LA rebellions, actually a couple years later, maybe. And I was processing all that, what it means to be looking back 25 years and how little has changed. So I know this is going to be a long sequence. I chose the sonnets because I needed a way to make art and not just rant. I needed something that will give me control. The enclosure of the sonnet is 14 lines, the turns that need to happen in there, the rhyme scheme, the metrical requirements gave me something to work on, right? It gave me a way to really control and to be in charge of what would otherwise, what I needed to be in charge of, because if I wasn't in charge of those feelings, who knows what I would have done. One sonnet wouldn't do, two sonnets wouldn't do, so I needed a whole heroic cycle. One thing I did, some of your viewers might know, but some may not, the form is called a heroic crown. A sonnet crown is when the last, and I'm not mansplaining to you, but just to, I'm mansplaining to your viewers. A crown, the last line of one sonnet would be the first line in the next. The last line here would be the first line in the next, so on and so forth, until you get to the last sonnet, and that last line is actually the first line. In a heroic crown, you have 15 sonnets, and the last sonnet is comprised of all the first lines of the previous 14 sonnets, okay? One thing I've noticed when I read sonnet crowns, or when I hear them being read, is that we tend to rush past the ending of one sonnet. When we find out what's going on, we rush past the ending and go right into the next. So there's no silence. So I was thinking of a way to subvert that. So what I did was I reversed the crown, I broke it up. And so now the way it works is, instead of the last line here being the first line here, the last line of this sonnet is the first line, or I'm sorry, the first line here is the last line here, okay? So you do get the recognition here, but not as immediately, okay? Also, because I'm dealing with a character, Ishmael Brinsley, who is, depending on your perspective, either a villain or a hero, and I'm writing an heroic crown, I wanted to break the crown. He's a broken hero, right? So all this gave me enough to work with, it gave me enough of a foundation that I could then just riff and play within the form and discover and do the things that forms allow you.
Just listening to you, I'm thinking how lucky your students are.
Thank you. I feel long-winded. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No, it's I think a lot of people are not aware of what goes into a poem. It's something that you can read. It's almost like a truism. You can read it so quickly, and you don't appreciate the time and the thought that goes into these works. Sometimes much more than perhaps even a novel or a short story, for all sorts of other reasons. It brings me to another question that I had, and there's so much to talk about, because I also wanted to talk about the moment we're in, and where the poet or the artist of color fits into that moment. But I feel like, you're always asked those kinds of questions, right? You're always asked to step up and explain things. And I appreciate you as a poet, as a writer, as someone who is processing experience and transforming it into art. And I'm animated by your example, because not that we're not here to bear witness, but we are here to make good art.
Yes,
And I think that's what you've dedicated your career to, and that's a slow process.
absolutely.
I'm joking that I want to start a slow writing movement, like the slow food movement. There's 10 years between these two collections. Can you talk a little bit about, how it is that you write and why it takes so long, and how you don't beat yourself up for it, if you don't, in fact?
Yeah, it's hard, you're talking about the craft. It made me reach for this book, Yeats, and Yeats has this poem, Adam's Curse, and in this poem, there are these friends sitting around a table and they're talking poetry, and the line, Yeats is talking to friends, he goes, "I said, a line will take us hours maybe, yet if it does not seem a moment's thought, our stitching and unstitching has been naught. Better go down upon your marrow bones and scrub a kitchen pavement, or break stones like an old pauper in all kinds of weather. For to articulate sweet sounds together is to work harder than all these, and yet be thought an idler by the noisy set of bankers, schoolmasters, and clergymen the martyrs call the world." So, you put the work in, and if you're doing it right, it does look easy, right? It does look easy, and yeah, and it takes time. It does take time. I like this idea of slow writing. There are so many books out there, right? If you go to Strand, you look, there really doesn't need to be another book written ever again, Um, so I don't see the point in rushing a book out just to be a part of the conversation, which I think is really an egocentric way to approach the craft, I think, right? And again, I go back to this essay by Donna Hall, where he makes a distinction between ambition for the self and ambition for the work, right? Creating good work takes time. And it is difficult, because 10 years between books, right? And friends are writing, friends, who maybe, say, my first book came out in 2010, we call ourselves a class of 2010, and other friends are publishing and being laureled and celebrated. And, there is that part of the ego that wants that as well. But I did hold back, and the idea was that when I did come out with something, I wanted it to be something that I could stand behind and that I felt good about. There is a pressure to publish, but also to, like I said, join conversations. So when there is a movement afoot, right? Maybe a social justice movement, right? You want to be part of the conversation. Well, the fact of the matter is, there will always be a social justice movement afoot, right? And a well-written poem will have a greater impact 5 years from now than something you just, spit out this week. So, I think a poorly written poem does your cause very little good, right? So, there's that. The other part of it is I just can't write quickly. I'm saying all this as if all this were deliberate choices that I make. But, if I could, I'd put out, good books every year. I just can't do it. I can't even, yeah. So part of me is, I'm talking all this shit, but really I couldn't write quickly if I tried,
That's fabulous. I could talk to you all morning. I think we're almost out of time, believe it or not. Do we have questions? Any other question? I think we.
There's one. Would you like to read it? There's one question. Or shall I read it?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sure. All right, so this question comes from our Deputy Director of the Public Humanities Lab, Julio Capo. He says, "Such a wonderful session. Thank you so much for sharing all of this with us. Goosebumps. So much of your work resonates as a reckoning and an invitation for healing and peace. In this very moment, what role do you see for poetry and the power of the written word for affecting change? Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you for that question. It's a huge question, right? And it's something that I think about often. I don't know. I don't know how much responsibility I place on artists to be agents of change.
Mm-hmm.
I think citizens should be agents of change in whatever way they can. I think the artists, if they're so compelled, right? The artist should create art if they're genuinely concerned with social justice. It'll show up in their art, right? I don't believe in shoulds. I don't believe in demanding that my artists be political leaders or pundits or commentators. But there are artists who can do this kind of work, right? There are your Bob Marleys of the world, your Claudia Rankins, and so on and so forth. But it's up to the individual artist, I think. Yeah. I write out of legitimate obsessions and out of legitimate concerns, and they just happen to be Black and brown folks getting shot. I mean, that's what's on my mind, right? But I would not at all require that of other artists, right? And the other part of it too, you need to get away from this sometimes, right? So sometimes you need poems, you need music, you need film that just take you somewhere else completely, right? I have a friend who's an African Americanist, and what her research project has to do with joys during slavery, right? So it's not that slavery was especially joyful, but how did these people sustain each other? Did they laugh? Did they have friends, right? Did they tell each other jokes? Did they dance? And I think it's such an important project. And I think that there's a role for artists to do the same thing, right? To provide joy when everything around you is bleak. So I watch my stand-up comedians, I watch cat videos, I watch baby videos, and I think there's a place for artists to write their baby and cat poems as well.
That's fabulous. John, we have one more minute, and I want to say David Rifkind, one of our colleagues, says no questions, just gratitude for a wonderful discussion. And Grace Toulousan, who we both know and adore, has written to say, miss seeing you both, this is wonderful. She wants to know, how do you find enough mental privacy or get in a place to do your best writing and not think about how the work will be received? Do you have rituals that get you there?
I have not rituals, but reminders. I have on this bulletin board a sign that says the work itself. I have John Coltrane, who lived for his art. I have Keats. I have my teacher, Philip Levine, right here. I'm almost not that glass of water over. So, I'm down here in the basement. This is where it all happens. So the ritual is just to come down here, clean off my desk and put my butt in the chair and just get busy.
You've inspired me.
You've inspired all of us. Thank you. And unfortunately, we are out of time, although I could listen to you all day, both of you, all day. So thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. And to the audience for listening. This, as I said, is the final episode of our season 3 Coffee and Conversations, and what a wonderful way to end. So thank you. Please mark your calendars and join us when Walter Mosley, Ilsa Calderon, Bill Nye the Science Guy, Abby Wambach, Joy Harho, Natalie Portman, Richard Ford, and many, many other thought leaders will share their work at the 37th Miami Book Fair, November 15 to 22. All readings, presentations, and conversations will be free and open to the public. So with that, I just say a humongous thank you. Be well and have as peaceful a day as possible. Thank you. Bye-bye. Cheers.